Hello and welcome back to Downtime Activities. Matthew here with a video style we haven't done for a little while. We got a little more Magic the Gathering content for you, specifically a Commander deck tech. And the Commander deck today that I'm going to be going over is my take on a Commander deck with 3 Commanders, kind of. It's going to be a partner pair mixed with a companion in order to have basically 3 creatures outside of the game that you get to start with access to. And it's a really fun and cool combination of creatures and a planeswalker that I love very much and have a ton of fun playing. So let's check out the deck. I have long toyed with the concept of combining a partner pair with a companion to essentially have 3 commanders for a deck. This is, as of now, my favorite version of this concept that I've been able to come up with. For this deck, I'm going to combine the combination of Jeska, Thrice Reborn, and Falthis, Shadowcat Familiar, along with Obosh the Prey Piercer as the companion, to create a Rakdos deck that's all about dealing massive amounts of damage and controlling the board. It's a really fun, cool combination of abilities, and these commanders and this companion play together pretty nicely. To start with, I'd like to go over Obosh, as since he is our companion and we're wanting to play with him in the companion zone, we are going to have to follow some pretty strict rules when it comes to making our deck. Specifically, Obosh requires all the cards in our starting deck to only have odd converted mana costs, apart from lands, of course. This is a pretty big limitation. There's a lot of cards, specifically cards that could be very good in this deck, that are 2 mana or 4 mana or 6 mana, that we're not going to be able to play. But the ability of having him in the companion zone along with our 2 commanders is really, really cool and worth the loss of the even converted mana cost stuff, in my opinion. I believe Obosh is worth this because of his ability, which is giving us the ability to deal double damage with all of our odd converted mana cost permanents, which is all of our permanents in this deck, basically, because Obosh requires that. This ability, stacked with some of the other stuff in our deck, can make for some huge damage turns. Onto our actual commanders, we're running Jeska Thrice Reborn and Falthis Shadowcat Familiar. These 2 go pretty well with Obosh and very well together. Jeska is a 3-mana Planeswalker commander that has an ability that will allow us to have a creature deal triple damage when dealing combat damage to opponents. This combined with Obosh makes even tiny threats deal massive amounts of damage with their multiplication stacked on top of each other. Her other ability is a -X ability that lets us deal damage equal to X to each of up to 3 targets, and this plays really nicely with our other commander, Falthis. Falthis gives all of our commanders Menace and Death Touch. Falthis will get these abilities, and so will Jeska, which works kind of weird because Jeska is a Planeswalker, but Death Touch still works with the Planeswalker and still reads the same way, meaning that -X ability on Jeska basically reads -1, destroy 3 target creatures, because when she deals damage and has Death Touch, it will be enough to kill with the Death Touch so long as the creature isn't indestructible or whatever, with her ability. These 2 partner really well together. It's a cool combo to control the board. I really, really like it. Another way you could take the deck here is to exchange Falthis for Vial Smasher the Fierce. This would be a little bit more aggressive, maybe slightly higher powered version of this deck. Vial Smasher is really good, but I prefer Falthis because I kind of like to have that interaction and that ability to police the board a little bit. If you want more of a straight damage version of this deck, Vial Smasher might be more your taste. Now let's get into the other cards that are going to make up this deck. To start with, I'm going to go over a couple of damage multiplying effects that I want to run in this deck that are kind of our Obosh stand-ins, or some things that'll stack well with Obosh. The first of these is going to be Imbermaw Hellion, who is a 5-mana red creature that will allow us to have our red sources dealing damage to deal an additional 1 damage. We'll also run Gratuitous Violence here, another way to just double damage when creatures we control deal damage to creatures or players. And lastly, we will also run an Ingrath's Marauder. It's the same text as Gratuitous Violence, just on a creature. Next up, I'm going to have a couple of creatures in this deck that have activated abilities to deal damage directly to players. One of these is Spear Spewer. Now, Spear Spewer deals damage to each player, which is something to keep in mind. You will be doming yourself with Spear Spewer, but it is a 1-mana creature that taps to deal 1 damage. And when that gets added up with all of our damage multiplying and additive effects, it can really stack up quickly for a 1-drop and put a big clock on our opponents. We'll also be running 2 very similar creatures in this same slot, which is the Brimstone Trebuchet and the Lightning Rig Crew. Both of these are 3-mana creatures that tap to deal 1 damage to each opponent. They also have untap abilities that are kind of dependent on other types of creatures that are not very relevant in this deck at all. We just are running them because they are both tap, deal 1 damage to each opponent. This, kind of like Spear Spewer, with all of those additive effects, means that we'll just be every turn tapping and dealing pretty huge amounts of damage as we get lots of this stuff stacked up. That's our activated ability player damage. We will also be running some triggered ability damage on a group of creatures as well. These creatures are going to be creatures along the lines of Karadect Parasite, Gutter Snipe, Hissing Iguanar, and Scab Clan Berserker. These are all creatures that, in one way or another, are going to allow us to deal direct damage to our opponents based on certain effects being triggered. Karadect Parasite is going to be triggering off of card draw, so long as you control a red permanent, and will be dealing 1 damage to the player who draws that card. Same as all these other things, this is going to get added and multiplied to with all these other effects, and players draw a lot of cards in Commander, so it'll dome them out very quickly. Gutter Snipe is going to be triggering off of when you're casting your instants and sorceries, Hissing Iguanar whenever creatures are dying, and Scab Clan Berserker is going to be, so long as you can get that Renown trigger to go off, doming your opponents whenever they're casting non-creature spells. A couple of other direct player damage creatures and permanents we're going to be running are Lightning Reaver, Stormbreath Dragon, and Price of Knowledge. Lightning Reaver is a 5-mana 3/3 with Fear and Haste, and whenever he's dealing combat damage to players, he'll get charge counters, and at the end of your turn, you'll deal damage equal to those charge counters to each of your opponents. So similarly, as these stack up and you get your multiplying effects stack up, it'll kind of just be an every end of turn huge doming of all your opponents. Stormbreath Dragon, super cool, hasty dragon that has protection from white, which will protect it from a lot of very popular removal spells in the format, and has the ability to go monstrous, and when it goes monstrous, it'll deal damage to each of your opponents equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. Again, players like to have full hands in Commander, they like to draw lots of cards. This can absolutely wipe people out, especially when it's getting doubled or tripled. Lastly, Price of Knowledge, a 7-mana enchantment that makes it so all players have no maximum hand size, will be each of your opponent's upkeeps doming them for how many cards they have in their hand. Same concept as Stormbreath Dragon, players are going to have a lot of cards in hand, and this is just going to be a huge clock. That's an enchantment, so it'll hopefully be a little harder for your opponents to interact with. While direct damage is going to kind of be the main game plan of this deck a lot of the time, we also want to go with combat damage victories a lot. These different creatures getting all this doubling and tripling of their damage can make it so even small creatures are really dangerous threats, especially with Jeska in the command zone. So we want to have stuff that works well with her and can help us make that clock much, much quicker. Some of the creature pump we're going to run is one of my all-time favorites, Dragon Mantle. Super simple, 1-mana enchantment, replaces itself when it enters, and gives a creature fire breathing, or pay a red, it gets +1/+0. When each of those +1/+0s are essentially +3/+0s or +5/+0s, with all these different stacking effects, it can be a really potent enchantment that's more or less free because it's cheap and it replaces itself when it enters the battlefield. We'll also run a Balduvian Rage. It is red and X. Because of the X technically being 0, it is technically a odd converted mana cost, meaning that it's legal to run in our deck, and it'll give +X/+0 until end of turn, as well as replace itself, similar to Dragon Mantle. I also are going to run Uncaged Fury. It gives +1/+1 in Double Strike for 3 mana at instant speed. Double Strike with triple or quadruple damage is obviously huge and awesome. Lastly, kind of spicy include Tainted Strike. It gives +1/+0 and Infect until end of turn, and with a lot of the creatures in this deck, having just one doubling effect or just Jeska's activated ability giving them triple damage, you throw a Tainted Strike on there, and that's one player out of the game. We're going to run some other creature pump here as well. Cards like Demonic Embrace, 3-mana enchantment that gives +3/+1 flying and makes the creature a demon. This is a super cool card because it'll give us some evasion to get past and deal lethal damage to our opponents, and we can also cast it from our graveyard by paying 3 life and discarding a card in addition to paying its mana cost, which will allow us to kind of recursively and keep on adding this evasion to any of the creatures that we're wanting to get in for the damage. We will also run Mask of Gristlebrand, a 3-mana equipment that equips for 3, and it'll give flying and lifelink. Similarly, we're going to be dealing lots of damage, so a single creature getting past can be really big. Flying is evasion. Lifelink will help keep us alive, especially if we've been spear spewing ourselves down since the beginning of the game. And it also has the added effect of whenever that creature dies, we get to pay X life, where X is its power, and then draw X cards, which is a really big refuel if they end up taking out whatever your threat is. We'll also run a Fire Shrieker here, a 3-mana equipment that equips for 2 and gives double strike. There's other double strike enabling things that I like a lot more. A card like Embercleave could be really, really powerful in this deck, but is unfortunately an even converted mana cost. Fire Shrieker is just kind of our best option for a repeatable source of double strike that is odd converted mana cost. Along with these ways to pump up our creatures and make them deal lots of damage, we also have some ways to help protect our creatures, because a lot of times we're going to be swinging with one big creature, and if our opponents take it out, it could really slow us down and mess up our game plan. The protection spells that I'm going to run here are cards like Malakir Rebirth, a 1-mana instant that lets us give the creature the ability to, when it dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under our control, and we lose 2 life. I love it because it's also a land, it's an MDFC, so it's basically free in the deck and awesome protection. 2 others I'm going to run are very, very similar, and that's Unnatural Endurance and Supernatural Stamina. Both of these have a protection ability as a 1-mana black instant, but they also both give +2/+0. So they double as that last little bit of pump if we need that to finish off an opponent, or a protection spell. They kind of serve dual purpose here, so they're really good includes in this deck. Along with protection, I am going to run some recursion in this deck, especially with Obosh. He's going to have a big target on his head, and unlike our true commanders, once Obosh dies, we don't get to just cast him again from the command zone. We have to find some way to get him out of our graveyard. The recursion I'm running are all-powerful, classic Reanimate, 1 mana, any creature onto the battlefield under your control, and you lose life equal to its converted mana cost. Really, really powerful reanimation spell. Whether you're using it on Obosh or your opponent's bomb, it'll be awesome. Also run Phyrexian Reclamation here, just a way to continue to get creatures from our graveyard repeatedly, especially Obosh. If they keep removing him, we can just keep bouncing him back to our hand and casting him again. And lastly, a kind of fun, cool Rakdos card here, Wake to Slaughter. It gives us the ability to choose 2 creatures in our graveyard, and our opponents are going to choose 1 to put to our hand, and the other will go to the battlefield and get haste, and then we exile at the beginning of the next end step. It has flashback, so we can do this twice, and it's kind of a cool way to set up some big combo-y turns where you cast that on Obosh and something else scary from your graveyard, and your opponents kind of want to put Obosh onto the battlefield, because if they do, then he'll be exiled and they won't have to worry about him anymore. But if they do that, then you get Obosh's ability and Obosh with haste that turn, and that can be the final doubling you need to just wipe them out. It's a cool card. I had a cool version of it, so I wanted to run it. We'll also be running some spells to just kind of draw cards in this deck. Any good commander deck needs to have the ability to refuel. So some of the spells that I like to run are Read the Bones, classic, Scry 2, draw 2, lose 2 life. Also run Skeletal Scrying, as it's 1 in X, similar to our previous 1 in X card. It's technically 1 converted mana cost, so it's legal for us to run. And it just requires us to exile X cards from our graveyard in addition to paying its normal cost. And then we get to draw X cards and lose X life. So it can be a really big refill. Also run Faithless Looting because it's just really good card selection, not really card advantage, but draw 2, discard 2, and flashback to do it again. It's a good card, good commander card. Also run a couple of enchantments to have some card advantage. The classic Phyrexian Arena, a 3-mana enchantment that just lets us draw a card and lose a life, in addition to our normal one every single turn. Really snowballs card advantage, especially if you get it early on. Similar, Theater of Horrors is a little more complicated, but does something pretty similar. It allows us to exile a card from the top of our library at the beginning of our upkeep, and so long as our opponents are losing life, we'll be able to cast those cards during our turn. It also has the ability to just ping an opponent, so it can kind of activate itself if we need to, although we should be damaging our opponents pretty much every turn. Lastly, for card advantage, I've got a kind of set of creatures that work well in the deck and are cool card advantage creatures. One of these will be Magus of the Wheel, 3-mana 3/3 that lets you wheel. It lets you discard, all players discard their hand and then draw 7 cards, a really cool refuel, and it's on a creature so we can bounce it back to our hand and stuff like that with previously mentioned cards. We'll also run Morbid Opportunist, a 3-mana 1/3 that whenever 1 or more other creatures die, allows you to draw a card as well, although that ability only triggers once each turn. Creatures are dying all the time, and you'll just have a kind of steady source of card advantage from this creature because of that. I also like to run Sin Prodder, a 3-mana 3/2 with Menace, and it's got a ability that's kind of... It's typically not very good in Commander, because at the beginning of your upkeep, you're revealing a card, and any opponent may have you put it straight into your graveyard, but if they do, it deals damage equal to that card's converted mana cost. Normally, this isn't a very big cost to pay in a Commander format where everyone's got 40 life, but when we're taxing our opponent's life totals and damaging them so often, and Sin Prodder's out there with a ×2 or a ×3 bonus to how much damage it's dealing off of that trigger, all of a sudden, we reveal a 5-drop, and our opponent would have to take 15 damage to not let us draw it, which is not very reasonable, especially if their life total is already low. So Sin Prodder can be a really cool source of card advantage. Lastly, we're going to run Florian, Voldaren Scion, who is a creature that lets us exile cards off the top of our library equal to an amount of life our opponents have lost in a turn, and then we get to exile one of them, put the rest on the bottom of our library in random order, and we can play that exiled card on that turn. This just turns into us nearly tutoring in the late game when we're dealing a massive amount of damage, and then in our second main phase, we dig down a huge number because of how much damage we've dealt, and find the most useful card for a situation. Next up, I'm going to go over the removal spells that I run in this deck. There's a lot of options here. Black and red have amazing removal, so it's really kind of dealer's choice. These are the 4 main spells as far as targeted removal that I've settled on and I really like. There's a lot of options here. The first one is Kolaghan's Command. I love the versatility. You can shock a creature, it can destroy an artifact, you can make somebody discard a card if you really need to, and it lets us regrow a creature from our graveyard to our hand, so another way to recur cards like Obosh. Also run Bedevil. Similarly, it's just got lots of options. It can destroy artifacts, creatures, or planeswalkers. Very useful. I like the variety. Artifacts and creatures getting hit. Really, really big. I also like Murderous Rider as a creature that also has an adventure side where you can destroy a creature or planeswalker. It's just a removal spell that doubles as a threat. Really, really powerful. I think a great include in this deck. Lastly, the classic Lightning Bolt. 1 mana, 3 damage. Early game removal spell, late game direct damage powerhouse when it gets doubled or tripled by these other effects in our deck. Speaking of cards like Lightning Bolt and dealing direct damage to our opponent's face, if we're not using activated and triggered abilities to dome out our opponents, or creatures to smash them, there's also a kind of third way that we can wipe our opponents out, and that's our burn package. We've got 3 spells in our deck that are X-burn spells, as ways of being removal spells when we need them to, and more importantly, just being finishers in the late game. The ones I've gone with are Crater's Claws, Banefire, and Fall of the Titans. These cards are all X damage spells that work a little differently depending on the situation and have kind of their own upsides. Crater's Claw is nice because if we have a bigger creature out, it'll just automatically be 2 plus whatever X is, giving us some additional damage. Banefire is awesome because if we cast it for a high enough number, it can't be countered, so that can be really big if you're playing a deck that's defending itself with counter spells and you're trying to finish them off. And Fall of the Titans can often allow us to kill 2 players so long as we can trigger that Surge ability. Next up, I'd like to go over the board wipes I'm running in this deck. I'm running a total of 4 board wipes, 3 technically against creatures and 1 that's a little different. The first of which is going to be a Rolling Earthquake, another X spell. It deals X damage to each creature without horsemanship and each player. It basically reads X damage to each creature and each player, unless you run into the weird horsemanship deck. If you do, they got you, I guess. But it also dealing damage to players makes it both a board wipe and a finisher, so super powerful in this deck. I also like Last One Standing as a 3 mana board wipe that you kill all but 1 creature chosen at random. Usually that's not going to be the most dangerous threat of one of your opponents. Sometimes it is, but I'm all for the roll of the dice. It's a good card. We'll also run the classic board wipe of Blasphemous Act, usually going to be 1 mana, 13 damage to each creature, which can wipe just about everything off the board. And lastly, Vandal Blast, because it's a 1 mana artifact destroying spell or a 5 mana destroy all artifacts that we don't control. It can absolutely set people back massively with all their mana rocks and stuff. If you've played Commander for any amount of time, you've probably seen Vandal Blast blow people out. It's a really good card. Next up, I'm going to go into our ramp options. Our ramp is a little limited because we are required to only run odd converted mana costs, so there's some cards that I wouldn't normally necessarily run in a Rakdos deck that I will run here because they have to be 1-drops or they have to be 3-drops. We can't run your classic 2 mana Signets and other 2 mana mana rocks. Add 1 mana of mana rocks that we're going to be running, or mana producing abilities at least on cards, is going to be the classic Soul Ring. It's overpowered. Everyone knows Soul Ring. Very, very good. Also run a Wayfarer's Bauble as a way to search out a land, and Curse of Opulence, which both will incentivize attacking of our opponents and allow us to accrue those gold tokens and ramp us into our bigger threats. For 3 mana ramp, it's really dealer's choice here. There's a million 3 mana artifact ramp spells in the format. Whatever ones you happen to have lying around, grab them, use them. There's probably optimal ones and non-optimal ones. The ones I'm running right now are a Worn Power Stone, as just it ramps for 2 instead of 1, which is powerful. Darksteel Ingot, so it can't be removed. Commander Sphere can replace itself, and Honored Heirloom as a mana rock that doubles as a little bit of just graveyard hate on the side. Our last little bit of ramp is going to be 2 5-drop ramp cards, or at least they're both kind of ramp cards. One is Mana Geyser, which will give you an absolute dump of red mana, equal to the number of tapped lands your opponents control, which in the late Commander game, where 3 people have tapped out before you play, means you just get this massive dump of mana and can usually dump your whole hand out, so long as you have enough black left over to do some of the other spells that include that. It's really cool, really powerful. It's 5 mana, so we can include it in this deck, so I'm going to run it here. The other 5 mana ramp spell that we're going to run is Neheb the Eternal, a 5 mana 4/6 creature that allows us to add 1 red mana to our mana pool for each 1 life our opponents have lost in our post-combat main phase. This similarly can be a huge dump of red mana after we've done a ton of damage to our opponents, so it allows us to dump our hand and just really progress beyond what our opponents can ramp into, so long as we're doming our opponents out. Lastly, I'm just going to go over a couple other kind of generic or interesting creatures that work well in the deck but don't necessarily have a specific role. They're just good in the deck. I like them, so that's what we're going to end up the deck with. The first of these is Cryptborn Horror, a 3 mana 0/0 with trample, but when it enters the battlefield, it gets X+1/+1 counters, where X is the total life lost by your opponents this turn. If we deal a bunch of damage, we can make a massive trampler. The next one's going to be Portraiser, 5 mana 4/4 pirate, so it will trigger our Lightning Recruit. Odd little side effect there. But also, it gives us additional combat steps, which can really spiral into us just taking everybody out. We'll also run a Brash Taunter as a 5 mana 1/1 that whenever it's dealt damage, it can deal that much damage to target opponent, and you can make it fight other creatures. This is awesome with board wipes that deal damage to all the creatures. Things like Blasphemous Act just turn into massive burn spells. Also, it really disincentivizes your opponents from attacking you, and any of that damage that it's taking and then reflecting gets multiplied by a lot of our multiplying effects. So it can make Brash Taunter can just be an absolute wall that no one can get through, and then you're forcing their creatures to fight it and doming them out with it. The last couple of kind of miscellaneous creatures we're going to run are some of our higher end threats in this deck. One of those is going to be Karazakar, the Eye Tyrant, 5 mana 5/5. Whenever you attack a player, you get to tap a creature they control and goad it, meaning you kind of get rid of their best blocker against whatever you're trying to do, and then also kind of force them to go after one of your opponents, so long as they survive that attack. And then it also has the ability that whenever an opponent attacks another one of your opponents, you and the attacking player each draw a card and lose a life. Card advantage incentivizes your opponents to attack each other, makes your life easier to burn them all out. Also be running a Drakaseth, Maw of Flames, a 7 mana 7/7 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, it'll deal 4 damage to a target, 3 damage to a target, and 3 damage to a target. All of this getting multiplied, doubled, tripled, whatever it is, can make you just dome out opponents or wipe all the kind of relevant threats on the board as it enters the battlefield. And lastly, another 7 mana big powerful dragon, Balefire Dragon, a 6/6 flyer. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. This usually translates into Balefire Dragon hits your opponent and wipes their board. Super powerful, especially when it's getting multiplied, like a lot of the cards in this deck. It's a really cool, fun, powerful top-end threat. That has been my deck list for the 3-commander Rakdos kind of hateful deck. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you like this concept. If you have any other ways that you've combined a partner pair with a companion, I'd love to see that. It's kind of a tricky and fun thought experiment to come up with, so any other cool combos, please throw those down in the comments below. If you like the deck and want to check it out, there'll be an untapped deck list down in the description. You can go ahead and go there, check it out, and see all the cards listed. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.